Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nazir daf Yud Zayin. Today's daf is dedicated for a Rav Ashi for Benaya Chaim ben Avital Ora, who is undergoing surgery today. So we're going to get started with a review of yesterday's daf. And the end of yesterday's daf was a little bit challenging. I want to go through make sure the basic principles are clear, and then we'll move on. We saw in Mishnah, somebody took upon Nazirut while they were in a cemetery. So this is a problem because when you're in a cemetery and you take upon Nazirut, you're actually impure. So you can't be a Nazir. On the other hand, as soon as you take on Nazirut, it kind of clicks in immediately because you have to immediately do what you say. So now you have this problem, which is you're theoretically a Nazir, but you're not really a Nazir because you're impure. So the Mishnah says, doesn't matter how long you were there, however long you stayed in the cemetery, it doesn't count toward your days of Nazirut. And not only that, of course, it doesn't count as your days of Nazirut, you're impure. But what it really means, and in fact, that language of the Gemara, Ein Olin L'Minyan, on Daf Yutet, the Gemara is going to get to and try to understand better. And you don't bring a sacrifice. Okay, what that really means, the chidush of this Mishnah, the unique halacha is that you don't bring a typical korban that a Nazir brings if he becomes impure. Okay, so again, let's just go through the process. A normal Nazir after 30 days, on day 31, when they're finished, they shave their hair and they bring a sacrifice. Okay. If a Nazir sometime during their Nazirut time period becomes impure, they stop, okay? All the previous days get erased. They start from scratch when they finish. And at the end of, they have to go through a purification process. At the end of 7 days, which is any purification process for a person who is impure to a dead person, they have to sprinkle the paraduma waters on day 3, on day 7, and on day 7 they also go to the mikvah, and then they're good to go. That's a normal person who's, and by the 7th day at sunset, they now become pure. If you're a Nazir and that happens, you have 1 or 2 extra things you have to do. Number 1, you shave your hair, and number 2, you bring a set of 3 sacrifices because you were a Nazir who became impure. I want to point out one difference, which I don't know the significance of, although maybe we'll discuss it today a little bit, which is I noticed in the Psukim in the Torah, and it's very rarely discussed, this issue. I tried to research it, and it really, nobody very rarely talked about. There's a difference between the shaving at the end of the 7 days of a Nazir who became impure and the shaving at the end of the 30 days. The difference is that the shaving at the end of the 30 days happens on day 31. With the sacrifices. On day 31, or whenever the date after your Nazirut ends, you do the sacrifices and the shaving all together. But if you become impure, on day 7, when you finish your impurity, you shave your hair. On day 8, you bring your sacrifices. So there's a split between them, which is very interesting. I'm not sure what the significance is, but it says very clearly in the Torah, on day 7, you do the shaving. On day 8, you bring the sacrifices. So perhaps there's more of a split between them. It's not so clear. So this will be relevant possibly later in the daf today. So according to this Mishnah, you don't bring those sacrifices. Notice it doesn't say anything about whether you shave or not. And that's going to be a question. And again, if you hold that the tiglachat and the hair, the shaving and the sacrifices go together, then if you don't bring sacrifices, you don't shave. But if you look at these split, the fact that you shave on day 7 and you bring the sacrifice on day 8 is 2 separate things that maybe you don't learn one from the other. So that's going to be a question that we're going to end our daf with is, do you shave or not? Okay, that's going to be one of the questions we're going to ask today. Now, so the Mishnah basically says, you don't have that whole thing. Of course, you have to wait the 7 days until your Nazirut takes effect. But, okay, it sounds like you're a Nazir right away, but you're not a Nazir who became impure because you were impure before the Nazirut started. So therefore, you don't bring a sacrifice. Yatsa v'nichnas, if you went out of the cemetery, which basically means you went out and you waited 7 days. We're going to get to this on Daf Yutet, but they're going to explain that's obviously what it means. You had to have gotten out of your impurity status. You became pure. Then your Nazirut took effect. And then you go back into the cemetery. Then you're a regular Nazir Shenitman. Then you'd have to bring a sacrifice. That's what the Mishnah tells us. Then there's this machloket Rabbi Eliezer. We're not going to get back to that about if you went in right away, or do you have to wait 2 days? Does it have to be a minimum of 2 days in order to be considered Nazir Shenitma? That issue is going to come up on Daf Yutet when they try to explain this part of the Mishnah better. But now our topic really is this machloket Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, which seems like Reish Lakish is opposed to our Mishnah, because Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan disagree about this case. If you take upon Nazir when you're in the cemetery, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the Nazir takes effect. Even though you're impure, you still took upon Nazir. According to Reish Lakish, and the way we understood Reish Lakish at this point is, it sounds like the Nazirut doesn't take effect until you leave, you become pure, and then you basically have to re-accept upon yourself Nazirut. Some of the commentaries say you don't actually have to say Harini Nazir, like actual words of acceptance of Nazirut, but you could just say, now I want it to take effect, or something like that, and then it will take effect. But without that, you're not a Nazir. So we started yesterday, it was a slew of questions of Rabbi Yochanan against Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan is going to bring source, 3 sources. Okay, we're going to number them, 1, 2, 3. Okay, the study guide will be very helpful today. What we're going to have, it's a very clear structure of our daf today. I'm going to go through actually in advance what the structure of the daf is, and then we'll review at the end so that you understand. We're going to have question on Reish Lakish, source. We already did 2, and we basically explained them. We're going to be up to the 3rd now. Okay, we're going to go through all those sources. The 3rd one is going to remain a question. We're not going to be able to explain Reish Lakish that way. And so Farber Rav Ashi is going to come in and say, we misunderstood Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish really held something a little different, and the machloket is about something a little different than what we thought. Then we're going to bring the same 3 sources, but in a different order, 1, 3, 2, to question. Rabbi Yochanan is going to throw them at Reish Lakish. What basically happened here, it sounds like, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish had this argument, and Rabbi Yochanan threw these 3 sources at Reish Lakish as the question, but how he threw them as questions depends on whether we go by the first understanding of the machloket or the second understanding of the machloket. So we basically have 2 traditions about how Rabbi Yochanan used these sources to question Reish Lakish. Okay, same 3 sources, the order is going to be different. Why is the order going to be different? Because in the first version, we're going to end with source 3, which is going to be a question, and we're not going to have an answer to it. In the second set of questions against Reish Lakish, we're going to end with source 2 is going to be the one that has no resolution, according to that understanding. And therefore, that's going to be the last one. We always want to end, because it's always a nice structure when you can say, we can resolve this, we can resolve this. Oh, but this one can't be resolved. So again, the order is going to be 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 3, 2. Then we're going to have a question of Rava, which is going to end without an answer. And then we're going to have a question with Rav Ashi's, which are going to bring 2 out of the 3 sources, source 1 and 2. So we're going to keep reviewing these sources over and over. Source 1 and 2, 1 is our Mishnah, and 2 is another source that we bring, the Tosafta, that we brought yesterday. Those 2 sources he's going to try to use to answer his question. They're going to be rejected, won't be able to answer his question. And then they're going to bring a 4th source that we hadn't seen yet. And we're going to end with that as an attempt to also answer his question, and that's also going to be rejected. So that's our structure for today. Without going on any further, let's get started. So I want to just review the questions of Rabbi Yochanan against Reish Lakish, because that will build, we're going to build on that today. So the first question we had, and I'll pull up the study guide for a minute. We'll see it inside there. Here are our questions. So we had our Mishnah. So Reish Lakish says there's no Nazirut. Now, what did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said, if you took on Nazirut when you were in the cemetery, it says you don't bring a sacrifice of tumah. But that seems to imply you are a Nazir, you just don't bring the sacrifice. That's an inference from the Mishnah, to which they said, no, maybe it means you're not a Nazir at all. Second question was, if you were Tameh and you took on Nazirut, exactly our case, right? Because our case could be you're in the cemetery, it could be you have any kind of impurity of a dead body, you don't necessarily have to be in a cemetery, but if you take on Nazirut when you're impure, it said asur legalech u'lishtot yain l'tamei l'metim. The 3 prohibitions apply, and not only do they apply, but you get lashes for them. So that seems to totally go against Reish Lakish, because why would you get lashes if it didn't even take effect? To which the Gemara answered a very odd answer, which was the beginning of Yud Zayin. It must be that you left the cemetery, then you'd have to add the words, and you went through a process of purification. On day 7, when you became pure, then you went back into the cemetery, okay, or maybe day 8, actually, right? And then you go back into the cemetery, then your Nazirut, right, kicked in. Now, the problem is what? Reish Lakish actually doesn't think your Nazirut kicks in. You have to actually accept it again upon yourself. So the This is what we say, the ikar chaser min hasefer. The main important words here are actually missing from the text. It should say, Hachav ma'askina biyotzei v'kibel al atzmo, right? And he accepts upon himself, and then he goes back into the cemetery. So you're missing two really important things in this line. One is that you have to wait 7 days. It's not just go out and come back in. And number two, it's that not only do you go out and come back in, but you would have to have accepted upon yourself to be a Nazir in between that time. So it's a bit of an interesting answer, the fact that the Gemara doesn't really express the important parts of this answer. But okay, let's accept it in any case. Eitiving, third source to contradict, and this, as I told you already, is going to totally knock out Reish Lakish and our understanding of him at this point. Ein Bain, this is a series of Ein Bain, you might remember from Megillah. Ein Bain, there's no difference between this and that, but this. So, Ein Bain Tamesh Nazal, which is our case, you're impure and you take upon yourself Nazirut. Linazil Tahol Shenitma. There's nothing between, right? The only difference between a person who took on Nazirut when they were impure and then became a Nazir, or you became a Nazir and then became impure. The only difference is Ela Tamesh Nazal Shvi'i Shelo Olelo Laminyan. If I took upon Nazirut when I was in the cemetery, what happens? What's my process? Remember, we learned I don't have to bring a sacrifice. So therefore, on day 7, I'm already finished. A normal person who becomes impure to a dead person doesn't bring sacrifices on day 8. They just have to go through the purification process with the red heifer waters. So, and the mikvah. But as soon as they're done on the 7th day, since there's no sacrifices, so they're finished on day 7, they can already on day 7, because we say, right, ole lekanu lekan, it can go both ways. So on day 7 already, you can start counting your count for Nazirut. But Nazir tahol shenitzma, but if you were a Nazir and then you became impure, since you have to wait the 7 days to become pure and you have to bring sacrifices on the 8th day, you certainly can't start counting your Nazirut until you do your sacrifices on day number 8. So ein shvi shelo olelo leminyan. Now, what does this source basically say? This is the only difference between them, which is when they can start counting to be a Nazir, either on day 7 or on day 8. So, if you're going to say the Nazirut doesn't even take hold yet, right? Like Reish Lakish says, unless you re-accept Nazirut upon yourself, it shouldn't just automatically kick in on day 7, like it seems to say. Why would it kick in on day 7? You would have to accept it upon yourself before it kicks into place. So therefore, Reish Lakish is on the outs, because this sounds like as soon as you sprinkle the paraduma waters, the red heifer waters on day 7 and go to the mikvah, immediately you start counting Nazirut. And that's definitely not what Reish Lakish thinks. So therefore, Rav Ashi, as I told you, we're now going to reject this understanding of Reish Lakish and understand the machloket different. Mechal, so it's Rav Ashi who suggests this. He says, I'm going to explain to you the machloket differently, and then he's going to explain the 3 questions in a different manner. Mechal kol amalu pligi dechayim. Okay, there's no debate about whether the Nazirut takes effect. Of course, I take upon Nazirut, I'm in the cemetery, the Nazirut takes effect. I'm a Nazir starting right now, which means basically I've got to get immediately out of the cemetery, right? I've got to get out of there, and I got to go through my purification process, and immediately after I'm going to be a Nazir. There's no debate about that. So what's their debate? Ela ki pligi lemilke. The machloket is about lashes. I'm going to read this according to the Rush. Not everybody reads it this way. That the lashes that we're talking about here are lashes for impurity. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan Sabah, only for impurity, not for, okay, it's going to be obvious. Why to make this differentiation is a good question. But Reish Lakish is going to agree that when it comes to cutting your hair and drinking wine, that you will get lashes. But for impurity, you won't get lashes. That's one reading. Another reading is lashes is for all 3 of them. You won't get lashes according to Reish Lakish. But I'm not going to read it according to that way. I'm going to read it the other way, which is the Rush's reading. That what we mean here is, because it also affects how you read some things further on. So I'm going to keep it simple and just read one reading, which is, but I always like to tell you that, know that there's other ways to read this. So what he means here is, now there's a logic to it. Since I was in the cemetery when I took upon Nazirut, specifically the issue of Tumah didn't really apply yet. I'm not going to get lashes for it. Now, what would I get lashes? So I'm in the cemetery. Imagine the scene. I take upon Nazirut, and now in order to get lashes, I need to be warned that it's forbidden. And do I know that, right? And I have to know that I get lashes for this. So you're next to me and you say to me, Michelle, if you stay in the cemetery any longer, you're going to get lashes. And then if I don't leave the cemetery right away, I'll be liable for lashes. That's the case. So Reish Lakish says, you don't get lashes for that, okay? Not for staying in the cemetery for a while, right? If I decide I'm not ready to leave yet, I won't get lashes for that. And Rabbi Yochanan says I do. So again, let's read it inside. Rabbi Yochanan savar kevan dechayla lake. Rabbi Yochanan says, since the Nazir takes effect, so yes, I'm going to get lashes. I basically need to get out of that cemetery as quickly as possible. Okay, one question we're going to see later of Rava is, how quickly exactly do I have to get out? We'll get back to that. Reish Lakish savar lo lake v'chayla. Reish Lakish says you don't get lashes, even though I am a Nazir, but I'm not going to get lashes for it because I was already impure when I started. So I'm not going to get lashes for remaining impure. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. So now again, once Rav Ashi reinterprets the machloket, he now has to explain what we know, and there's certain facts on the ground. The facts on the ground are that Rabbi Yochanan brought these three sources to contradict Reish Lakish. So now we're going to have to explain them, the same three sources, but different. They're going to contradict in different ways. So let's read them inside. So again, I told you the order was 1, 2, 3. Now it's going to be 1, 3, 2. We're going to do first the first source, then the last source, and then the middle source, because we want to end with the one that remains a question and isn't resolved. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. So the first question is, Misha Nazal, our Mishnah, v'hu bebeit hakvarot, and he's in the cemetery when he takes upon his zilut. Afilu hayasham 30 yom, even if it was 30 days. Ein olin l'min minyan ve'eno mevi korban tumah. So now, what are we going to infer from here? Korban tumah udelo ma'ite. It sounds like you're not going to bring a korban tumah for your impurity. However, what's not mentioned, in other words, if you weren't going to get lashes either, it should have said, and you don't get lashes. So the fact that it doesn't say that, we can infer ha milka lake. You must be getting lashes for this, which goes against Reish Lakish. So the Gemara explains, no, you can explain it according to Reish Lakish. How so? B'dinhu delitne eno loke. It should have also said, and you don't get lashes. But why didn't it? Well, mishum dekabay limit aseifa, because of the end of the Mishnah, or the next part of the Mishnah, which said, yatsa v'nichnas, if you went out and went back in, olelo min minyan u'mevi korban tum'ah. Because there it wanted to specify that in that case, when you went out, got purified, and then waited your 7 days, and then went back in, you would bring a korban tumah. Then you would bring a korban tumah. What they were really focusing on was the korban. In other words, the subject of this Mishnah was the sacrifice. If you bring a sacrifice, do not. When do you? When don't you? That's all. And that's why Tana Reisha Eino maybe korban tumah. And that's why the Reisha specified this. The beginning part specified you don't bring a korban, because they wanted to differentiate between someone who was impure when they took on Nazirut and stayed in the cemetery versus someone who was impure when they took on Nazirut, left, finished the purification process. There was a moment where the Nazirut took place, which Reish Lakish would agree with too, and then went back in, then left to bring a sacrifice. They weren't addressing the lashes issue. So this inference is not a valid inference to question Reish Lakish. That was source 1. Now we're going to go to source 2 to question Reish Lakish. Tana. Okay, this is now here we're going to be a little bit trickier, because here it's going to say the only difference, and here only becomes very important, the only difference between one who was impure and took on Nazirut while they were in an impure status to a Nazir tahor. Okay, this is going to get easier as the daf goes on, because we're going to see these sources over and over. The main difference between them, a Nazir tahor shenitma, if I was a regular Nazir and then I became impure, what does it say? The only difference between them is what day they start counting their Nazirut again. Is it on day 7, because you basically finished the process already since there's no sacrifice? Or is it on day 8, because in the other case, there is a sacrifice on day 8? But what would you assume from here? What's the inference? But in terms of lashes for impurity, they must be equal, because it doesn't say that that's a difference between them. And again, that they're going to assume Ein Bain means there's only this difference, and it's coming to exclude some other issue, which is not a difference. Now, you might think Ein Bain means this is the only, and there's absolutely nothing else. but that's not how they understand. They're going to understand it's this, but not something else. So the question is, what's the but not? So we assume the but not is but not lashes for impurity. To which the Gemara says, and again, this is the Rosh's reading, because we'll read this differently for somebody else. Amarle lo litiglachat zevezeshavim. And the Rosh adds the word tiglachat and wine. In other words, remember, according to the Rosh, we're differentiating. Tuma, Reish Lakish thinks you don't get lashes, but the other two prohibitions, you do get lashes. So when it says ain bain this to that, but this, there's no difference other than when you start counting unisigut. That's to say, but when it comes to lashes for cutting your hair or drinking wine, you do get lashes. But it's not relating to lashes for impurity. Okay, again, that's one way to read this line. There's another way. The tricky part, I'll just tell you, because later today, we're going to have the exact same inference, the opposite. When we need this to answer a question, we're going to say the inference is halitiglachat zevezeshavin, and then we're going to reject and say, oh no, it's for malkot. Okay, so we're going to do the exact opposite here, but there the tiglachat is not going to mean what it means here, and that's the weakness in the Rosh. Tiglachat means two things when it comes to Nazir. Tiglachat means number one, which is here, forbidden to cut your hair. Tiglachat also means you shave your hair in the process. We talked about when Nazir becomes tamei lamet, he has to shave his hair on day 7. But, right, and then the question is going to be, what about if you're in the Beit Farot, you have to shave your hair? So tiglachat later is going to mean that shaving and not the fact that it's forbidden to shave your hair. So it makes this a little bit tricky, and it's a weakness in the Rosh because the same exact phrase is going to be used for here, tiglachat and wine, which is don't cut your hair and don't drink wine and you'll get lashes for it. And tiglachat there is going to be the fact that you don't shave, right? Whether you shave or don't shave on day 7. Anyway, if you didn't catch that, it's okay. It was a little bit more, a little bit of a zoom out and say something's going on here that you have to pay attention to. But if you didn't catch it, it's fine. So right now, where are we in our structure? Okay, let's pull up again the study guide because it'll help organize. Yeah, in the study guide. So here, let's just to review where we were up to. We had the first explanation of the machloka between them. We had 3 questions that Rabbi Yochanan brought against Reish Lakish. We answered 2. We got stuck with the last one. Rav Ashi says, so forget it. Definitely the Nizirut does kick in. You don't need this reacceptance of Nizirut like we described before. The whole question really between them is, do you get lashes for impurity? And then we brought source number 1, which seems to indicate, because it doesn't talk about lashes, it must be lashes, or you would get lashes, which we say, no, it just wasn't referring to lashes. Then source number 2, this is the only difference, which will come to exclude lashes, to which it says, no, it's coming to exclude tiglachat, to say tiglachat, they're equal. Okay, there's no difference between them when it comes to shaving and drinking wine, but for impurity, they could be different. To which the Gemara is now going to ask, you can see here in the structure, there's a bit of a question and answer on this answer. Okay, so we had an answer to Reish Lakish, but now we're going to question something. Wait, Avalinya milkot mai. Wait, but malkot mai. What are you saying about malkot then? Zelo keveze, loke. Still, this doesn't make sense with this source. Why? You want to say that it's another difference between them. So if so, litnie, it should have then said, Ein bein tamei nazir, tamei shenazar lenazir tohor shenitma. There's no difference between them other than number 1, shvi olem min aminyan, and this one ain't shvi, right? 7th day, 8th day. Number 2, you get lashes for impurity, and you don't get lashes for impurity. It should have said that. To which the Gemara answers a very simple answer. Bitakante kamarin. Again, that wasn't the topic of that source. What was that source focusing on? Fixing Nazir, right? Fixing a Nazir that became impure, getting out of it. When do you get out of it? On day 7 or on day 8, right? The moving forward process. Bikilkule lo kamari. They weren't talking about someone who messed up, right? Who stayed impure, stayed in the cemetery too long, or went back and became impure. That they weren't referring to. In other words, again, every time we could say this source was particularly focused toward something and not that, then we can say, oh, this had nothing to do with our topic at all, and therefore it's not a question. Third source, which again is the second source from last time, which we ended with yesterday. Tashma mishaya. Now this one's going to be very clearly against him. There's going to be no way around it. Mishaya tamei v'nazal asur legaleach u'lishtot yain. Okay, if you were impure when you took upon nizirut, you're immediately forbidden to shave and to drink wine. Ve'im gilach. Notice it doesn't say and also to become impure to dead, but it's going to appear in a second. That's obvious that it's forbidden. If you did any one of those three, including becoming impure to the dead, you get lashes. Okay, there's no way to read Reish Lakish. There's no way for Reish Lakish to explain that in any way that fits with him, because it says clearly, if you become impure to the dead, in a case where you took upon Nazirut when you were already impure, you get Sofeget HaRa'im, which means you get lashes. So tiyuvta. This really knocks out Reish Lakish. So again, very clear structure. We have one understanding of the machloket. We brought three sources. The last one was left as an open question, and therefore Rav Ashi reinterpreted the machloket. But even with the reinterpretation of the machloket clearly Nazirut does apply. It's just a question: do you get lashes or not for impurity of the dead? To which, in the end, we reject that as well. We bring the same three sources in a different order, and the last one is left as an open question, and we're stuck. Now we're leaving it aside, as if like Reish Lakish is probably just rejected by the Gemara, saying this is not a really good opinion. And now we're moving on. As I told you, the next part of the Gemara is two different questions. One is Rava, he's going to ask a question. We're going to explain exactly what case the question is referring to, and then we're going to be just answering with the teiku. We don't know the answer. And then we're going to have Rav Ashi's question, which is going to go back to sources 1 and 2, and then bring a fourth source that we haven't seen yet to try to answer his question. But all the attempts to answer his question can be rejected for the same reasons that we rejected these earlier sources, because they can be understood in different ways. If you're going to try to infer this, you can infer that, or it's not necessarily clear that that's what you can have, the only way to read that source. Once you can read the source in multiple ways, it doesn't prove or disprove anything. Before we're using them to reject, this time we're going to use them to get to an answer. Bye, Rava. Many people change, the Bach changes it to Nazal instead of Nazir, which has a big difference. Nazir b'hu b'beit hakvarot is different from Nazal b'hu b'beit hakvarot. We're obviously talking about the case where you took upon Nazirut while you're in the cemetery, which is the same case as our Mishnah. So he's asking if Nazar b'beit hakvarot mahu. Now, before we even go on, I want to explain one halacha. Something similar to this would be someone who becomes impure when they're in the temple. You're not allowed to go to the temple when you're impure. What if you're in the temple and someone drops dead in the temple? Okay, have a heart attack right there in the middle of the temple, and now you're impure to the dead because you're in the building with this person who's impure to the dead, who died. So now, what do you have to do? You have to get out of the temple as quickly as possible. But there's a halacha that you have what's called shihiyah. You have the amount of time, and you need time to get out. So how much time is that? It's defined as the amount of time it takes to bow down, because you're in the temple. So they translate as, they use the appropriate actions that are relevant to the place. The amount of time it takes to bow down, that's the amount of time you have to basically get out of the temple. So if you waited less than that amount of time, you wouldn't get lashed. Let's say, again, you're standing there and someone says, do you know if you stay in the temple now, they make a big announcement on the loudspeaker, everybody get out, anyone who stays longer is going to get lashes, and then you basically run out. The amount of time you have is Kadesh Tachavayad. The amount of time it takes to bow down. So now, yes, I see you're all reminding us of Yomi, of people who actually killed each other, stabbed each other in the temple, which would be another situation. So now, they ask the following question. If you're a Nazir in Beit HaKvarot, so now let's make the same comparison. You took upon Nazirut while you're in the cemetery. Your friend who's standing next to you says, you got to get out of the cemetery right now because you're a Nazir, and if you don't get out quickly, you're going to get lashes. So, do you get this extra time dispensation of something similar to the amount of time it takes to bow, like in the temple, or not? Although, so first the Gemara says, what exactly is the case? If it was a little different, and I was standing in the cemetery, and I told you, I'm going to become a Nazir right now, and you say to me, do you know if you become a Nazir right now, you're going to get lashes because it's going to be forbidden for you to be in the cemetery. So if that's the case, lama li shehiyah, I certainly wouldn't get any dispensation and extra time, because Nazir my time alo bai shehiyah de kamatrabe. Let's compare that to a case where I was a Nazir and I'm about to walk into a cemetery. We're both on the way to a funeral together, and you say to me, what are you doing here? Don't you know you're a Nazirah? If you walk into the cemetery, you're going to get lashes. Now, of course, we don't say there, I get some extra time. I can just run in for a minute and then come out. Nobody says that there. Why? To come out of it, because I was warned before I did it. So here also, if you warn me before I took upon Nazirut, then of course I would get lashes. And of course, there's no extra time for me. We don't say that. When I'm warned before, right? Hachanami, likewise here, kamatrabe. I was warned before, so I wouldn't get any extra time. Moving now to Amud Bet. Ela kigon. So what would be the case? Here they come up with creative cases of someone who was they want to create a situation where I was what we call anus. It wasn't exactly my fault, and it just kind of happened. The Gemara loves this kind of example. I go into the cemetery being carried in a box in some sort of, right, it sounds pretty dreary, like they carry you in a coffin type thing in the cemetery, but you go in. What's the unique part about this? Not because there's coffins in the cemetery. It's because if I'm in a box that's covered, I'm protected from impurity. The impurity can't get into the box. Okay, these are different kinds of boxes, different kinds of shapes they're talking about. Now, uba chavero, and then you came along, uparan elav maziva, and you open it up in a way that the tomb is now going to get into where I am. Then they want to know, at that point, now that they opened it, do I get this dispensation? Because it wasn't really my fault that I ended up here. Do I have this amount of time, or do I not have that amount of time? Okay, and the issue is, do I have to scoot and skedaddle and get out that second, or do I have a little bit of time to get out before I get the lashes? So that's what his question is, and the Gemara answers teku. They don't have an answer. Moving on now to Rav Ashi's question, and that's the last part. So again, just to review the structure, Machloket Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, 3 questions of Rabbi Yochanan against Reish Lakish, reinterpretation of what their machloket is based on the fact that we got stuck there. Then 3 questions, again, the same 3 sources in a different order, end with a problem in the last one. It says clearly you get lashes, so it's very hard to understand Reish Lakish's position. Then this question of Rava, trying to figure out exactly in what case did he ask his question. That's kind of someone later coming and saying, we don't even really understand this question, and then they clarify exactly what he's talking about. And either which way the answer is taken, we don't have an answer. And now Rav Ashi, who, as I already told you, is going to ask a question, and then we're going to bring 2 out of the 3 sources we saw before, source 1 and 2, to answer his question. Okay, again, if you want to look at the study guide, you can see it very clearly inside, which is we're going to basically bring source 1, and I'm sorry, I said it wrong. It's source 1 and 3 from before. Okay, he's going to ask a question, and we're going to explain the 2 sides of the question, and then we're going to bring source 1, source 3, and then I called it source 4, the final source, which is a new source that we haven't yet seen today. So let's go through our sources now. And each time there's going to be a rejection of the source. This isn't going to be able to answer the question, basically. So by Rav Ashi, Nazar v'hu bebeit hakbarot ta'un giluach ola. So now I told you we were going to get to this. If when you took upon Nazirut, you were in the cemetery. So again, this is our case. You don't bring a sacrifice, but, and this is what I mentioned before, so now I'll re-mention it and maybe you'll understand it better, which is, again, at the end of Nazirut, the sacrifice and the shaving usually go together. But at the end of the process of purification, the shaving happens on the day you become purified. And the korbanot, the sacrifices, only happen the following day. So the question is, are those 2 separate units, and they're not as connected as they seem to be in the other? And therefore, perhaps you would do the shaving even though you don't bring the sacrifices. It's clear from our Mishnah you don't bring the sacrifices, but maybe you would do the shaving. So now Rav Ashi says, here are the 2 sides of the question. And as when you need tiglachat, it's for a tahor shenitma. It's for a person who was pure to begin with, took upon Nazirut, a regular case, and then became impure. Why? In other words, he's trying to figure out why are you doing this shaving? It's almost like you're starting again, right? And you messed up your Nazirut. You were a Nazir, you messed it up. So you got to start from scratch. Start with no hair, basically. Aval Tamesha Nazar, no. But maybe a Tamesha Nazar, maybe it's not relevant to this person because they didn't mess up anything. They just never got started yet. Or maybe it doesn't make a difference and it's just part of the purification process and you would do it here. Again, it's not a part of a regular purification process, but yes, for a Nazir who's impure. So Tashma, let's try to learn from our Mishnah. So again, this is our case. You're in the cemetery. What does it say? The halach in the Mishnah is, it doesn't count for you and you don't bring a sacrifice. Now, korban tumah hu maite. What can you infer from here? It just says you don't bring a korban. That must mean you don't bring a korban, but giluchei bai. But you do need to shave, because if you didn't need to shave, it should have said, and you don't shave. To which the Gemara rejects and says, what are you talking about? Matam kamar. It's giving the reason why, meaning, okay, it doesn't exactly give the reason, but we'll explain it like this. You can read the Mishnah in the following way. Matam eno mevi korban tumaha mishum delo bai giluchei. Why don't you bring a korban tumah? Because you don't need a shave, and since you don't need a shave, the korban and the giluach go hand in hand. Since you don't need a shave, you don't bring the korban. Basically saying this is all one and the same. It's like a catchphrase for including both. And really, they say it's almost even more so, which is since you don't shave, that's why you don't bring the korban. It just didn't say it, but that's what it means. Again, this isn't the only way to read the Mishnah, but it's a possible way, which means we can't use the Mishnah to prove our point, to get to an answer. Next source, Tashma, as I said, source number 3, the Ein Bain source. Again, this is going to be a good source because Ein Bain again means this is the only difference, not this, which obviously is not a difference, right? It's going to be the same, which we're going to assume maybe it means the shaving is the same. So it's going to be the reverse of how we used it last time. You'll see in a minute. There's no difference between these two people. We've been talking about the one who takes on Nazirut in the cemetery and the one who takes on Nazirut and then becomes Tameh. It's just a matter of which day do you start recounting your Nazirut. Day 1 is day 7, or day 1 of Nazirut is day 8. My love, so since it doesn't say so, right? What must it be coming to exclude? It's the same for shaving, that you would shave though at the end of the process. Now here, this is why I said, this is what I mentioned earlier. Last time when it said number 1, that was the second stage. First they said, isn't it for malkot? And they said, no, it's for shaving. And there the shaving meant lashes for shaving if you cut your hair during the time period. Here it means the tiglachat is the process of shaving your hair after 7 days, okay? At the end, on the 7th day. To which they say, lo, halamakos, you could say, no, they're equivalent they're the same for the issue of lashes, but it's not relating to the shaving. To which obviously the Gemara says, like it did last time, okay, wait. So you're going to say, this doesn't really resolve the problem, because you want to say them for shaving, what you want to point out right now is that one would shave and one wouldn't. Nazir, right? If you took on Nazir in the cemetery, you wouldn't shave. If that's the case, then it should be listed among the differences. This is exactly like a mirror image of the sugya from before, to which they say the answer is Tana Shvi'isha lo v'chol mileh. This actually was included. How was it included? Because the shaving is done on day 7. And what was it talking about? Day 7 already starts your new count, because what it meant was whatever's supposed to happen on day 7, it's all the same, basically. In other words, day 7, what it relates to is day 7 already starts your new thing, but everything else about day 7 kind of is the same as the other, or something along those lines. It's not exactly clear cut how they use this. But what they're basically saying is, it was somewhat included as if, I'm sorry, I said it wrong. That's why I got confused for a second. You want to say you don't shave on day 7 because day 7, Olem Aminyan, and the other one, it's day 8, because these are different relating to everything about day 7, meaning you also don't shave, and you can also start your Nizirut because you don't have the sacrifices. So it was included in that already. So that was source 3. Right, source 3 from last time, our second source in this stage. Now we get to a new source that we haven't seen yet. This is a bit of a long source. It's a style of a midrash halacha, which is we start with halacha, but then we try to prove it from either the text or from logic. Tashma. Ainli ella, what we're talking about here is days of leprosy. Until now, we've been talking about a Nazir who becomes impure to the dead. Now, one fact on the ground is, when you're a Nazir who becomes impure to the dead, assuming you were a Nazir, then whenever you become impure, it cancels all the previous days. But if you're a leper, it doesn't cancel all the previous days. It just stops, okay? And then, let's say day 10, you became a leper. You finish your leprosy process. First of all, you also shave at the end of the leprosy process, and you bring sacrifices, very similar. But then you continue counting where you were before. So now they're kind of raising a question about this, though. They want to know, clearly the days you're impure don't count as part of, you don't count those as days of Nazirut, obviously. They even erase all the ones from before. But Yemei Chaluto, which is when you're in Mitzorah Muchlat, it's called, when you're a definite leper, Minayin. How do we know? What they're suggesting is maybe if I became a leper on day 10, since it doesn't cancel all my previous days, maybe I keep counting those days as Nazir days. Perhaps. And when I finish my Mitzorah, 8 days later, I'm on day 18 of my Nazirut and not on day 11. So, Vidinu, they say, I'm going to prove it to you by logic. Ma yimei tumato megaleach maybe korban. Since you made tumato, what happens at the end? When you become impure, you shave and bring a sacrifice. Likewise, af yimei chaluto megaleach maybe korban. So since there's a similarity about them, that they both end in the same way, and Nazir became impure, shaves and brings a sacrifice, and any leper shaves and brings a sacrifice at the end of their process. So likewise, this Nazir that became a leper also shaves and brings a sacrifice. Just like the impure days don't count, also the leper days don't count. So that's their logical inference. To which the Braita says, but wait, look, I can reject that logical inference. From where? From our situation of someone who took upon Nazir while they were in not yet. We're going to get there in a minute. Look, why not? Because there's a difference between the Tumah days and the leprosy days, which is obvious. The Tumah days are obviously much more severe because they cancel all the first ones. And therefore, of course, they can't count. If they erase the previous days, we're obviously not going to count them. But the leprosy days don't cancel. So maybe since they don't cancel, maybe they actually count. So basically, your attempt to try to use that as a paradigm for that doesn't really work because they're not similar at all. One cancels all the previous days, one doesn't. So therefore, maybe you really would count them. So now we have to prove how we know they don't. And for that, we're going to bring in our case. Amarta Uma Nazir Bekevel, that's our case. You took upon Nazirut while you're in the cemetery. This is the key phrase in how you understand this phrase. Whose hair will be shaved, okay, which sounds like what? You shave your hair. That's Rav Ashi. You became a Nazir in the cemetery, you do shave your hair. So now, his hair is ra'oi l'tiglachat, and for tiglachat, for Nazirut, right? Ein olin lo min minyan, and those days don't count. So therefore, yemei chaluto, she'ein ra'oi l'tiglachat, lo kol sheken she'ein olin lo min minyan. Since the days of a leper, the hair you're growing is not going to be used for Nazirut at all. Why? Because you're going to shave it off before you go back to counting your Nazirut. So since you're not even shaving your hair as a Nazir, right? You're shaving it for some other reason. So it means it's not ra'oi l'tiglachat of a Nazir. Your hair is not growing at this point for Nazirut. Obviously, kol sheken she'ein olin lo min minyan. In other words, when you're a Nazir who took upon Nazirut in the cemetery, your hair will be shaved for the purposes of a Nazir. Now, it's a little unclear what this means yet. In a second, we're going to talk about what shaving are we talking about. But because there your hair is shaved for a Nazir and they don't count, all the more so when your hair isn't shaved and isn't growing to be shaved for a Nazir. You're shaving it for some other reason, and it won't actually be part of your Nazir in the end. When you finish your Nazirut, the hair growth you have when you're a leper is not part of the shaving because you've shaved it all off. So, all the more so, those days shouldn't count as Nazir days. To which the Gemara now says, okay, what shaving were we talking about there? My lav tiglachat tuma, doesn't it mean then that when it said the hair is ra'oi l'tiglachat during those days, it's ra'oi for what shaving? For the shaving of your hair when you finish those 7 days, which is a shaving, again, it's not the shaving at the end of the Nazirut, but it's a shaving for the purposes of Nazir, because a regular person who becomes tamei, lamet, and impure dead doesn't shave their hair. This is hair growing for the purposes because you're a Nazir specifically. And there you see, you must shave at the end of 7 days. To which the Gemara says, who says that's the hair growth that we're talking about? Hair growth to shave at the end of 7 days of impurity? No. Lo tiglachat tahara. It could be you don't shave at the end of those 7 days. And what it means is that while you're in those 7 days of impurity, the hair you're growing is ultimately, at the end of your 30 days of Nazirut, or however long your Nazirut is going to be shaved for the purposes of Nazirut, as opposed to the Nazir who becomes a leper, whose hair gets shaved off before he finishes the nizirut, and the hair is shaved off because he's a leper, and the hair that he's growing during that week of leprosy is not going to be used ultimately as his nizirut, for his nizirut. So in the end, they say this doesn't really prove it. And now what the Gemara is going to do, and we'll see that tomorrow, hachinami mistaber, we're going to prove this reading, that it's tiglacha tahara and not tum'ah, which doesn't prove anything of what we want. We're going to prove the reading. What the Gemara is actually going to do, we'll see it tomorrow, is they're going to prove the reading, but then reject the proof. They're not going to reject the reading. They're just going to reject, it's not so clear cut. Okay, first they want to say it's clear that they're talking about the shaving at the end and that there is no shaving before, but in the end, it's not going to be clear, but either which way, we're still left with lack of clarity, and therefore we can't answer Rav Ashi's question from here. And Rav Ashi tried to prove this to show, look, you shave at the end of 7 days, but this clearly doesn't necessarily mean that you shave at the end of 7 days, and therefore we're still left without an answer for Rav Ashi's question. So, quick review. Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan, 2 ways of reading it, 2 ways of showing those 3 sources that Rabbi Yochanan used to reject. Question of Rava, what does this question mean? And then ends in a teku. Question of Rav Ashi, sources 1 and 3 that we saw before were tried to be brought as proofs to get to an answer to his question, not proofs, but to answer his question. We said those could be read in different ways, not necessarily the way you want to read them. And this source number 4, this new source, which is the 3rd source we brought to answer Rav Ashi's question, which in the end is also inconclusive. That's it for today. Wishing everybody a great day.